And that's because that's where we last left off a year ago. An entire year ago, we took a detour through the letter to the Hebrews. So Exodus, if you recall, is the second book of the Bible. If you find your place there, I invite you to stand as we hear from God's holy, inerrant, which means without error, and an inspired word. Verses 13 and 27. The next day, Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people standing around you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Moses, his father-in-law, said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God, and you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all this people also will go to their place in peace. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, as I was saying before, we are returning back to the book of Exodus, and we are picking up here in the halfway point, somewhere in the halfway point. Exodus is 40 chapters long, but this is near the halfway point, and it turns out halfway even through chapter 18. Now, since it's been such a long time, I don't suppose that that you guys all remember with freshness in your mind what we had gone through in the previous 18 chapters. So before we dive into this text, verses 13 to 27, I'm just going to go ahead and review for us. We're going to zoom out a bit and try to look at the big picture of where we've been in Exodus. How did Exodus begin? Where we've been and where we last left off. So basically, here's the basic story of Exodus. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the main characters, or those are some of the main characters in Genesis, the previous book. Those descendants of the people that God chose to make a covenant with, remember, God chose Abraham, and the promise went down to Isaac, and then went to Jacob. Those people became a great nation. And however, while they became a great nation in Israel, they grew in number. They also, it turns out, became enslaved in Egypt. All right, so there's these two things. There's a great nation in Egypt who are all enslaved. And so God raises up Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. And you might recall the story of how when he was a baby, his mother put him into a basket so that he would be saved, because there was a genocide of when Pharaoh was trying to kill all the young male babies, Moses' life was saved through the waters. And of course, that salvation of Moses was a forecast. It was a foretelling of what would happen to Israel in large. In any case, Moses is sent by God to deliver the people out of Egypt. And this is no easy task because Pharaoh is very resistant. He is hard-hearted, and he keeps saying no. And so God, in order to force Pharaoh's hand, sends 10 plagues upon Egypt as a form of judgment against Egypt, but also to demonstrate to everyone who's watching that their gods are not really gods, but Yahweh is the true and living God. And each time, of course, Pharaoh resists. And so eventually it gets to the point where God sends the 10th plague, in which all the firstborn of the land are killed. However, Israel's firstborn are not killed because the Feast of Passover is instituted, in which the lamb is killed instead, and the blood of the lamb is painted, you remember, on the doorpost and on the lintel, so that the angel of death passes over those houses, and they are saved. By the way, did you guys know that this week is Passover, it turns out? Well, because of that, Pharaoh finally relents. He says, all right, go, leave. And Israel leaves Egypt that very night. However, only a few days later, Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, what have we done? We let all these slaves go. And he takes his best chariots with him to go chase down the Israelites. Well, when you take chariots, typically on your mind is not capture. On your mind is what? Kill. So he's really going after the Israelites to show them who's boss. The Israelites, on the other hand, they've come to a dead end. They took a weird route. Instead of going the normal way, they went southward and went headlong into the Red Sea. And they can't swim across, so they're stuck there. And Pharaoh is rushing upon them with all his chariots. And what happens? You remember? The Israelites are crying out. They're like, we're going to die. And God has Moses raise his staff over the sea, and the waters part, right? The waters part, and the people are able to cross over on dry land. The Egyptians, eventually, they give chase. And then what happens? The Israelites are safely over on the other side, and the Red Sea swallows them up. And God saves them a second time. He brings them out of Egypt, but also he defeats all their enemies as he causes them to safely get through the waters. And out there in the wilderness, all the people go through a series of trials. These are fairly common trials that we, maybe not to the extent that they experience, but we have some experience, which is thirst. Hunger, and then thirst again. Do you remember how they responded to those trials? Did they respond well? No, they didn't respond well. They grumbled each time. They accused God that God was up to no good, that God was trying to kill them out there. Nevertheless, God, in all his graciousness and patience, continues to provide for them. And that's what leads up to this point. In chapter 18, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes and meets Moses to see for himself all that God has done. And today we get here in verse 13. This is partly through Jethro's visit, where the featured topic, if you're following along in our passage, is leadership. For those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, you might think, leadership again? That's what 2 weeks ago, the passage it was about leadership. What are you trying to say, Charles? Well, I did not plan this. I did not plan that the end of Hebrews would be about leadership. And then picking right back up in Exodus 18, it would also be about leadership. I think this is God's sovereign. It's his doing. God wants us to know about leadership. because perhaps it's on his agenda, not only that we would know about it, but that we would respond to the call that's going out. And you'll see what I mean by the call. Well, the call is right there. Our sermon title is called Spiritual Leaders Needed. Leaders, not singular, spiritual leader needed, but spiritual leaders needed. And I think I didn't plan this, but God in his sovereignty is addressing us, CGC, and in particular, CGC EM. All right, well, we're going to dive now into our text. Moses and Jethro have had a reunion. In fact, Moses has been telling Jethro about all that God has done, and Jethro, who is a priest of Midian, he comes to know God, and it looks like he's evangelized. He comes to know God, and he sacrifices, he worships God. And so the first half of chapter 18 is about that. But now we come to the second half. The next day is how verse 13 begins. Moses sat to judge the people. In other words, the next day after this great reunion, and even they had a worship service, Moses has to get back to work. Right? You guys ever have visitors come over to your place and you show them a good time, but then they're on vacation, but you're not. So you have to get back to work. That's what Moses is doing. He's getting back to work. And the people stood around Moses from morning till evening, all day long. And Moses' father saw all that he was doing for the people, and he said, "What is this you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" A scene I have, by the way. Does this scene remind you of anything? This scene reminds me of the DMV. Of course, in the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicle Services, there's many workers, but there's a lot of people standing around while sitting, but all day long just to get a driver's license or something like that. It's worse here. It's one person servicing thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of people here. That's what Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, is asking. Why are you doing this alone? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another. I make them know the statutes of God and his laws. Moses, his role, his day job, apparently, other than leading the people to the promised land, is he's a judge. The people come to him with their disputes, because after all, when people live in close quarters with one another, they're going to have troubles. They're going to have issues. I mean, just look at any family. There's disputes within a family. How much more when there's an entire society? And so they need someone in a position of authority to settle these conflicts, to answer these pressing questions that they're dealing with. And who's the man for the job? Of course, it's God's prophet. They want to know, what does God say about this issue, this difficulty, this dispute that we're having? And so that's what Moses does all day long. He judges between people as God's prophet. He makes them know that our passage says the statutes of God and his laws. In other words, what Moses does is he applies the law of God. What God has revealed is good and right and true. He applies that law on their lives. Now, we learned from one reason 2 weeks ago, our passage, it turned out, was on leadership as well, back in Hebrews 13. We learned one reason that God appoints leaders for his people. Do you remember? Do you remember why God appoints leaders for his people? It's to lead. Remember, leaders lead the people on the way to the promised land. But here, our passage shows that there's another reason, a second reason, we might say, for why the people need leaders. By the way, these two reasons, leading the people to the promised land, and the second reason I'm going to talk about, these are not unrelated. These are not two different, they're kind of related to each other. In any case, the second reason that the congregation, the people of God, need leaders is to help us to apply the law of God into our lives. And actually, that was a point that was emphasized in the book of Hebrews. But as God's redeemed people, how are we supposed to live? We are called to live according to his will. Remember that from Hebrews? We are called to live in ways that are pleasing to him. Why? Because God has put his name on us. We are not our own people. We are his people. That means we belong to him. As much as he belongs to us, we belong to him. That's why we are called to live now lives that are pleasing to him, according to his will. That's why we need spiritual leaders. What do spiritual leaders do? They help us to walk according to his will. Again, spiritual leaders lead us on the way to the promised land, but they also help us to live in a way that is pleasing to him. Now, that's what Moses was doing as God's prophet. But there's a big problem, a huge problem. We can all see it. Jethro sees it. Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening? This is an inefficient system. If Jethro walked into the DMV today, he'd be like, this is an inefficient system. And how much worse back then with just one man trying to service thousands upon thousands of people. And this is Moses' father-in-law, Jethro's diagnosis. Verse 17, what you are doing is not good. This is bad. Why? You're setting yourself up for disaster. Verse 18, you and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. I keep going back to the DMV example because I didn't even plan it in my sermon notes, but it just like a forceful train. I haven't been to the DMV in a while, but any of you who've been there, it's a dreadful experience. You know this. The workers there, are they happy? They're not happy. And the people there who are trying to go to by the way, do we have any DMV workers here? The people there are also not happy because they have to do all this waiting around. That's basically what he's saying. You're setting yourself up for disaster. Moses, you're only human. You have limits. You need help. By the way, a small note that's worth pointing out is that Jethro is basically a new believer. And so this shows us that the way God gives wisdom to us, he primarily is through his word or through the usual sources, as in like pastors and elders, but also God also sometimes gives us wisdom through brand new believers, right? In other words, God can use anyone to speak the truth to us. And we see that happening here through Jethro. Returning back to the main problem at hand, Moses, he is the lone spiritual leader of a church comprised of many, many thousands of people. Yes, on the one hand, he is God's chosen prophet to lead Israel. But as Jethro points out, this is unsustainable. You will certainly wear yourself out. You're going to burn, you know the word, you're going to burn out. And also, not just you, the people with you are going to wear themselves out. Because after all, they have to wait around all day just to be heard. Now, here at CGC, we do not have nearly the same problem as Moses did. One coworker trying to do it all. However, I think we do suffer from a similar problem as many churches. And this is true of many churches, which is that there are a few coworkers carrying most of the load. Right? Have you heard the 80-20 rule? They call it a rule because it happens so often. 20% of the church does 80% of the work. It's disproportionate, right? For it to be proportionate or fair, you would expect 20% does 20%, 50% does 50%. You would expect everyone to be involved, but it turns out, as many churches, 20% of the people do 80% of the work, or something like that. Or to put it a different way, at our church, we have some very faithful coworkers who've been serving for many years, wearing many different hats over the years, decades even, but there are very few new coworkers joining their ranks. And that's true in our church. To which I think Jethro's word to Moses also applies to us, which is what you are doing is not good. Speaking to me, speaking to all of us. You and the people will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone, or the few here that who are working are not able to do it alone. We need, as we'll see here, we need all hands on deck. That's what Jethro is saying. Verse 19. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. I just want to point out here, Jethro is not saying, you got to listen to me because I know more. Because I know more than God. He's not putting him on God's level. What Jethro means is that he's asking for, I have good advice for you, and if God blesses you, may it be the case. And so here is step one. Jethro's advice has 2 steps. All right, step 1 is this. Moses, keep doing what you're doing. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. In other words, you're going to keep being a prophet. That's what prophets do. Prophets are intermediaries between us and God. Here's us, and there's God, and prophets are a go-between. We talk to the prophet in order to speak to God. God speaks to the prophet in order to speak to us. And so Moses is that intermediary who warns the people, who tells the people about God's law. Moses is the prophet who tells the people how they should live, what they must do. By the way, who performs that role for us? That was in the Old Testament. Who performs the role of prophet for us here in the time of the New Testament? You might think the answer might be pastor, and it's not. It's not. It's Jesus. Jesus is the prophet now. He is the greater Moses, and he is our mediator before God. We do not need someone to go between us and God. We don't need a priest, for example. You can speak to God yourself. God gives his words to you himself. This is what we learned in Hebrews, by the way, the last book that we were in. We have such a great high priest that what? That now we can draw near to the throne of grace with confidence. We know that when we come in Jesus' name, yes, we are right there before God. Jesus is our king, and he is king over and he is head over the church. And by his spirit and his word, and yes, he still does use human instruments such as pastors and elders. He teaches us how we must walk and what we must do. And so that's where the second step in Jethro's advice comes in, verse 21. This is the practical part of the advice. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens. Moses, you need help. And so what's the solution? Find help from among the people. Find those men that will help you to share the load of shepherding the flock of God. And this task cannot be limited to one man or a few men. This is supposed to be back then, and then the debate that we can now. Pieces. Facing some spiritual leadership in this message. Which means older. So
Versus down in numbers. It's a beginning of knowledge. It's the what? It's the it is to God absolutely today. People down here, not if it, not with the other most usually if we don't operate people are pretty big. See them around us, they us. They make our lives miserable at great rates. God, well, can't really see it, it's small. But it's more qualified to be leaders. God is big. God is honored. Here. Glorified. That's majority. And I sort of versus this, and then he will necessarily have other politics. They kind of make their on bodies. It is that he's also going to be trustworthy. It's going to be alive. It's like, man, we're here for God. It's also going to be a man of integrity. Right? See how we go together? Also a man of integrity. I'm not a man of integrity. You know, it's not a man of integrity. It's a man of integrity. It's not about personal gain. It's not honest gain. He's not. A man of integrity is not in it to take advantage of this whole. You know how like you. Position. These people will have to report. This makes God says. There's it's not just it's receiving its responsibility and work. We don't see expectations on us. It's also because there's a lot of stuff with it. You get them to the next part, blah, 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 blah. Can't have same mentality or leaders in the church. Leaders in the church not motivated by leader so that you get yes, you get responsibility to be your participation also like this. Such a person not qualified because they're trying to they're any game. It's sort of take this global. It's a race. We have received attention. We have received family. We have received an persons. We have received an unchanging kingdom of such a person who daily has that. Nothing to gain from the retirement or evaluation or sort of makes them they want to live God's eyes love. Before we do anything, let me ask you, what kind of person is just someone here, someone who is trustworthy? Have I described a super Christian? Super Christian, like there's I haven't. I'm not this it's an extraordinary person. This kind of like stupid hurting. This is yeah. People get here. You know, leaders are not especially great Christians. They're just It's race that into the hearts and minds of lives. That now, the only thing that is response. HTC exists and probably to be used. Another one I just talked about is unique vegetarianism. Brief. Spiritual leadership said, look what gave them from among all people. People. That's how it applies to us. That's the thing here. It comes to us, finding leaders for their own ways, not on right? So CDC, English industry. But it looks us find leaders within them for not access that is an example. CCM industry. Step up, build, way to prescription. Industry. Third friend of all other leadership that's much superior concept leaders. Education. Spiritual leaders. Also, sincere. Government, we see that in our church. Our church by to the pastors. And others. Very different it's about you know, people with types, elders and pastors. So it turns out that spiritual leadership not only exercised by people with license. Because spiritual leaders do they help people in their lives. We don't have that. We ever tell someone a lot of God word in their life. It's your job. It's part of what you do. They also should have any other research and you're them. Probably a lot. We're going to say, well, we got the first world. We need all it's not the way. We're going over. So, on the one hand, you're going to those people come from. He has decided to go online. Help there's live in God's will. So, actually, all about. So, that we following one another. Maybe it's not my kind of reporters that set it down. It seems like some requirements for the green of certain requirements. They let it go. They go together. It is. It's me. People. People. It's going to be. Pretty. You see ways to I would say. Whether you're going to get sort of thing is going to start that way. We'll see teams not gone. And there's not many of you today here. And it's aspire to so old. Amen. Let's go. I think that as we return back to the experience in the book of this, it speaks about leadership. So choosing wisely. Also, and that means these things like letters ourselves, that's never be a culture. It is that now suffer from many churches. Very church. Oh, yeah, yes, it's here. So this is named.